So I'm going to talk about the street, but first let's establish why this is important as a public space. Street is the most ubiquitous public space. It is the most pan-cultural public space, and that's particularly important when we're looking at talking to the UN to formulate sort of guidelines that might be applicable across the globe. And the street has the potential to be a quintessential public space out of all other spaces and typologies. Just like any other public space, the street has many benefits that we know of public space. But because streets are a network, inherently, they don't have to be necessarily made into a network, that they allow for very, very easy communication systems in our cities and settlements. And they allow for easy possibilities of making things, making policy changes such as movement or walkability. Streets are also important because in an urbanizing sort of world, we know that cities are good for us. And what is particularly important in cities is the notion of proximity. Throughout time, that has been the one central reason why we've developed cities and people have gravitated to cities. And that proximity has leads to two things: to access, to opportunity and services, and to encounter with people of all kinds and ideas. That's sort of the central advantage, if you will, of the city. And if you look at any city, you can do this with your own city, map the streets and the space aside in two different colors. You see proximity, access, and encounter is easiest possible in the street as a network. But another reason why streets are important is that if you, for example, collapse all of the black blocks, which is public or private property, into one area and the streets into another, so not highways, just streets and alleys. In this case, this is a part of Cincinnati that I call home now. 42% of this is streets. Anywhere from over 25% to over 50% of area in cities is in streets. And of course, we know that there has been a legacy of sort of writing about the streets from Jane Jacobs, Bernard Rudofsky, Alan Jacobs, so on and so forth, that the image of a city, in fact, is often the image developed through the street. So in the context of future of places, or rather future of public places or public spaces, thinking about the street is particularly important because it is such a large component that already exists in cities. And as I said, it's a pan-cultural resource in our settlements across. The second thing I want to talk about is how we sense the street, or rather any public space. And that's important because we have to be kind of cognizant that there are both methods, both inductive as well as deductive methods that we need to apply to look at these public spaces and public places. And there are advantages in doing that because in a multicultural, sort of very diverse city of today, we need very, very diverse methods to understand the complexity that cities provide to us. So these methods have to be personal, they have to be engaged, and yes, they're very time-consuming, as you'll see. So this is an important point for us to note that we do not have any easy ways to understand public space, and we need to put that effort in. What is at hand is the fact that we have all these disciplines that have, in fact, very different but very rich methods. And we need to tap into this disciplinary sort of richness and be open-ended in terms of our methods to understand and sense public places, public spaces, and streets in this context. So I'm going to talk about a public space that is at the intersection of a parochial space of a neighborhood. I'm going to talk about the neighborhood commercial street, which has the possibility of being a social place, but it also has the possibility of being so many other things as listed here. It is a place that can be the image of the neighborhood. It can be something that, in fact, becomes and creates an identity for the neighborhood. And it could be something that can make the neighborhood and the city legible. So the biggest competitive advantage of a neighborhood commercial street is the fact that it is a place where people can just on their daily round encounter others as a part of just sort of doing their everyday services. They can encounter other people. It's a place of easy access for all, being at the edge or within a neighborhood. It is a place that is easily accessible to people with limited mobility, whether it is because of economic reasons or physical reasons or health reasons. It's also an interesting place, a public space, which is in transition, where what I call the neighborhood meets the city, and the citizen, the neighborhood resident becomes the citizen of the city. This is particularly valuable in the case of children, as you'll see in a little bit. So I'm going to talk about 3 streets in the Boston metropolitan area, and they all are in the same context. They're connected to the same transportation system. They are near universities. They have sort of similar conditions, and yet they're quite different in where they are. So the first thing is to look at what these streets are, what happens here. Are there any social, are they social spaces at all? And it's important to note that all these pictures, and I'll show you a lot of these, are taken on only these 3 streets. This is not an idea of collecting pictures from around the world and hoping that this could be a street or a neighborhood commercial street. Anything that you see here is taken on these 3 streets. So these are places to gather and meet for people who are from different backgrounds, have different reasons to be on the street. It's a place much like an outdoor living room for you to relax. It's a place to learn. It's a place to learn social skills, particularly for children. It's a place to learn how to negotiate the environment. Again, the transitional first public space in the neighborhood. It's a place to learn and teach. It's a place to learn about nature, to learn about what goes on, different uses and activities. It's a place for discussion and dialogue. Again, all this is happening on these 3 streets in a very short time, and within about a year. It's a place to learn how to cooperate and how to be creative. It's a place to learn about participation and to learn about your civic responsibilities, duties, and rights. And it's a place to be exposed to people who are unlike yourself, to learn about empathy. It's a place where you learn to sort of accept or know the other. It's a place to play and explore. And some of these are my favorite pictures here, where this child who's probably under 2 years old thinks of these cluttered, perhaps even ugly, newspaper, magazine dispensing boxes as a little playground, because every one that he opens is hinged in a different place, is a different material. When he lets the handle go, it makes a different sound. Sometimes he finds things inside it which are fun and colorful, and if he picks them and throws them out, he knows his father comes running, so it's really, really fun for this kid. This one, of course, looks at this object, this artifact, not for what we thought we might use it for, but to do everything else other than sitting. But it's also a place for play for adults. It's a place for information, whether it's just information about the neighborhood, or it's an information about a campaign within the neighborhood or in the city. It's a place for expression, whether it's at Halloween time, or it might be some local artist trying to display something on a very ordinary store show window. It's a place for sensory stimulus that's important for us in everyday sort of life, to see things, to listen to things, to smell things, and to engage in the environment in a very sensory way. So in sensing this space, I again look at literature and sociology, and I find that there are these 3 ways to classify the social behaviors that are visible on the street. There's passive sociability, which is being alone together, so which is really being in the public but not be bothered by others. And there's fleeting sociability and enduring sociability. So passive sociability, things like public solitude, spectating and display, relaxation and play, that you might be able to see, in some of these slides. Fleeting sociability is just a simple wave or a nod to an acquaintance or a neighbor, a momentary stop for a chat, maybe asking somebody for time, although we don't need to do that very much anymore because of our phones. Play and even triangulation, what White called triangulation, that might happen through an event or even a mishap where people might exchange sort of fleeting interactions. And enduring sociability, which might be intimate relationships and affiliations, that may be planned gatherings or regular meetings in a place. All of these are slightly different sort of ways or behaviors of sociability that all occur. And there is literature that talks about weak ties, perhaps even becoming stronger ties, and this is part of that idea. So the question here is, how do we measure this, and can we measure it, and what are the ways? I talked about all the different methods that can be used, and I'm particularly interested in looking at and trying out different methods to understand and measure sociability. So this is the way I created this sociability index, where I'm interested in looking at people who are staying at the street, not the people who are walking by, but people who are there either alone or in dyads, triads, or in a group, and how long they stay. So those are the three sort of variables, components that make the sociability index, if you will. So the three streets here are drawn in a plan elevation combination. Appleyard did this very well, borrowed from him. But the idea is that every dot that you see here is a person. And these are 30 different walk-bys. If anybody's interested in detailed methodology, it's been written about. I can tell you, I can give you details on that. And it's also being tested in different places to see how this really works and whether it's robust or not. So each dot here is a person, and these are 30 walk-bys done from early morning on weekdays till 11 o'clock at night on weekdays and weeknights. Obviously, we see that on these three streets, there are some places where there are more people compared to other places. So some of you might say that, well, I know the answer. It's not rocket science. This is where there are cafes, there are restaurants. And yes, there is anecdotal information. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There is a lot of good knowledge. There's commonsensical knowledge. But there's other things as well, which get teased out when we apply multiple methods in this kind of research. So if we just collectively put them together, we see how the differences of those dots that you were seeing in the three streets. This is a chart that is putting all of these little segments into one chart, and you find the difference of where people are and where they're not. Now, remember, all these streets have the same sort of larger scale advantage of transportation and disadvantage of being near a busy street with vehicles, with parking or not enough parking, being near a university, allowing for more people, so on and so forth. So there is a level of equality in terms of what they are in the context that they are in. And yet there are these differences. These are the differences in the duration of how long people stay at these places. The darker is the longer time frame. And then, of course, there are attitudes and there are feelings of people that are important to know. So asking people things like, what brings you here? Do you use this location more than others? Do you use this block more? If yes, why? And then you collect all that information. If not, why not? So on and so forth. You look at what are the three most important things about the block that you would not want to change, things you would like to change or add. So you develop these through interviews and surveys that are, it's again, very, very painstaking. It's very time consuming. And then you look at this and study how people create territories and how territories expand and what do businesses do to either help people with those territories or otherwise. So I won't go into details of all this because this is a pretty sort of laborious methods to study this, but so on and so forth. And then you try and understand, this is an important point for urban designers in the room, that we talk about the street as an enclosure and a space. It's almost impossible to do in a new city, in American cities. You have to think about the street as pieces of streets, that in fact, there are two potential wonderfully enclosed streets on one street. This is on Mass Ave, which in itself is not a particularly wonderful street. But if you look at the edges, they in fact create very nice streets, neighborhood commercial streets on each of the edges. Understanding it, going there, drawing the street, trying to see what's going on, what are the qualities of the streets as spaces. Anyway, so looking at the literature from Site to Lynch, Gordon Cullen, Jacobs, William White, Gale, all of that, there's all of this knowledge that is there. I teased out 11 variables that we can, in fact, use statistical methods, sort of quasi-soft statistical methods like simple regressions and factor analyses, to try and get this information teased out. And the 5 that you see with orange dots next to them hold up in the regression analysis. So it's kind of obvious. Stride walk width, seating. William White said people will sit where there is places to sit. So it's kind of obvious. But there are other things that come up. The personalization of the building facade of the edge, or community places or third places in Oldenburg's term. And these are not things that are determined by me as an external observer, but these are things that are determined by people who define different third places depending on what their attachment to that place is. In any case, then we can cluster these and see, does they make any sense? And does it come together in ways that we can understand and contribute to the knowledge base? And the idea that these are, in fact, qualities of form, these are qualities of activity and land use, if you will, and they're also sort of qualities that are of pure meaning to people in terms of attachment that makes this sociability possible. But all sociability is not equal. So if we think about people hanging out in streets, that can be just done through the idea of consumption of space. All you're doing is consuming space. You're eating, drinking, buying. You can create social activity through that and sociable streets through that. But you can also create a space that is productive, where people are actually doing things, they are engaging, they're making, it's a balance between the production of space and the consumption of space. And there are differences between these 3 locations, that there are places that are more sort of imbalance with consumption versus otherwise. And all of this is doable as long as we have the time and energy to do it, that you try to map this idea that many things can coexist, social, economic, leisure, political, all these kinds of, and survival activities can in fact happen. And the 2 keywords here, and many, many groups can coexist, groups that might be seemingly disparate in terms of mothers with infants and panhandlers and homeless and so on and so forth. But they can coexist with 2 words in mind, time and space. So there are, even on very short, simple, small blocks, there are different spaces that can be occupied, that are occupied by different groups, or there are different time at which different groups occupy that space. So this notion that the space has to be monocultural is in fact something that we've created out of fear and the notion of safety, which is, I think, overhyped. We don't necessarily need safety all the time. Yes, we need places to be safe, but we don't need to be hyper about that. And so multiple groups can coexist, as we see here around these. And sociability can be rich, just, and robust when there are all of these activities that occur. Political activities, economic activities, activities of survival, because these create very different kinds of sociability that really, really make it a very robust. So how do we do this out of all that regression and qualitative, quantitative studies? Here are 7 things. I have elaboration on this and elaboration on that elaboration in the book. I won't bore you with that. I like guidelines, but I'm not a big fan of prescriptive guidelines, because there has to be some overarching framework that might be provided, but then there has to be interpretation that has to be contextual. And we've heard that in this conference a lot, particularly if you're going to talk about something that would become a global kind of guideline. In any case, so even for these streets, there are these guidelines which have fair amount of details within that I think we may not have time to go into. But what I want to get into is something that's particularly important here in terms of what are our meta strategies then in thinking about public spaces or streets. And I want to pick up on a couple things here. This idea in ecological thinking that talks about health of systems. And if we think of public spaces or streets as systems, it doesn't, in fact, work through competition. It, in fact, works through coexistence. And there are multiple interconnected systems that are both stable and unstable, things that are forming, things that are dying, and things that are sort of in a stable equilibrium. But not everything is in an equilibrium. There are always things in flux. It's a very open-ended system. And most importantly, there is conflict. Conflict is not a problem. Conflict is something that is a result of many different things using the space, occupying it, and in fact, it is managed through distribution and diffusion. Now, this is mostly things that ecologists talk about, and good ecologies deal with conflict in this way. This has actually some very useful things for us to think about in public space, where conflict can be managed through external frameworks that might help vulnerable populations, but also help design spaces or manage spaces through that can work out conflict through distribution and diffusion. So this is something that's actually things that we might find in a street in India. Again, obviously, we don't have time to get into details here, but what goes on in a street here? Many of you are thinking, what's the connection between the street in India and the streets that you showed us in the Boston metropolitan area? The idea, and there are cultural differences, obviously. The idea is not to transport one sort of notion from here to there, but the idea is to understand how this works as such a sort of robust and diverse system. And as we might notice that there is everything that goes on here. There's socializing, there's making, mending, washing, drying, cooking, preaching, praying, and so on. Importantly, the workings of the neighborhood are visible on the street in India. And it's a real place of communication, exchange, and leisure, and almost everything. So what would we have to do to make the street a social place? By looking at all those things that I talked about, it has to be understood as a place of interchange for access, travel, commerce, leisure, sociability, and survival. It has to be both a path and a place, not just a path, which is what we consider streets to be. The idea of coexistence of different people, activities, and forms has to be accepted and sort of supported in what we do. The idea of localized controls that work through negotiation that are required at that particular time. Not all of these will be known, but the idea that there will be negotiations that will happen between the different users. And there have to be myriad governance systems, not just systems that are governing transport or economic transaction, but social and cultural transaction as well. So we look at the way that, these are last couple slides. For centuries, we managed problems through the idea of simplicity. This is a paper by Warren Weaver looking at complexity over time. And at the time, when we thought about things with simple variables, this is a problem, it's one problem, we'll solve it. The street, in fact, was a very complex and multidimensional space, often chaotic, not equal, but multidimensional. In the 20th century, we started to look at things. We knew that there were multiple things that affected certain behavior or phenomena, but we did not yet mature to understand that things are interrelated as we do now. In the 20th century, what Richard Sennett talked about yesterday through the Charter of Athens, but also through garden cities as well as broadacre cities, these big ideas about cities, we created homogeneous and monocultural spaces. in today's multicultural, heterogeneous city, where we understand complexity as something that can be organized and something that's a good thing, we need to think about the street as a multicultural, connected, complex, and heterogeneous space. The final slide, again, for those of you who are urban designers here, in the traditional typological taxonomy, street has always been understood as a path, as a place of movement. And we have these very definite places of gathering and stationary activities, the plazas and the squares and the parks. And in my mind, that's a big barrier to thinking about the street as a place, a space which is public, which is a huge percentage of the city, not just of public space. We need to change that, and no amount of guidelines can create social public spaces if we first don't believe in the street as a place. Thank you.